But I don't have any cards left over, so if you've asked questions, I misplaced your cards. I did get one email question, and the question had to do with, is the words of Jesus in the Last Supper, we did a walkthrough of the Mass, this is my body, this is my blood, do they refer to only the future, the Eucharist that will be after the death and resurrection of Jesus, or are they already in some way his body and blood? My answer is tentative, but I think that I would say that they really are already the body and blood of Jesus, present sacramentally, even though he is still physically present. So that would be my presupposition at this point, until I find evidence to the contrary. So, okay, so tonight, we have a great topic. It's one of my favorite topics. And the technical title is the Liturgy of the Church. And so when you think about what the Liturgy of the Church is all about, one way of describing the Liturgy of the Church is anything that is the Liturgy of the Church is what we call the public prayer of the Church. So all of us have our private ways of praying, but the Liturgy of the Church are the public ways, the official ways that we pray together. Another way of looking at it, which is the way I'm going to approach it tonight, is the liturgy is the way that we as Catholics sanctify time or make time sacred. So we'll start with the most fundamental mysteries of time. So if you think back to the ancient world, our primitive human ancestors, their awareness of time before the age of watches and cell phones and clocks, by the way, if you ever turn your cell phones on, make sure they're silent, and even before church bells and so forth, the awareness of time would have been around things like day and night. The setting of the sun would be the time when you would be arriving home to kind of finish your day's work, and you would mostly stay indoors because you couldn't see outside very well. We've transformed the world now with artificial lights. So I'll do my quick plug. I think that every city in Nashville, we should start working on it, should become what we call a dark sky community, so that the outdoor lights only shine down and don't bleed up into the sky, so you can still see the stars and the moon and so forth at night. So that's my quick plug for a dark sky community. So the other thing that of course people would have been very aware of are the seasons of the year, especially far from the equator. So in the northern hemisphere, where Judaism and Christianity developed, the awareness that you were moving through seasons was part of the human experience. Less so at the equator, of course. Dry and wet maybe, but not spring, summer, winter, fall. Shortening and lengthening of days. So there was an awareness of what we would call the year based on that movement of seasons. Awareness of day and night, and awareness of the seasons of the moon, the phases of the moon. So the idea of months developed from the cycle of the moon. So they do that roughly every 30 days. They had a full moon, and then the moon would diminish and gradually grow back. So time got oriented very much around the seasons of the year, around day and night, around the moons that they live through. There is one element of time that's a big chunk of time, bigger than a minute, smaller than a month, that we take for granted. What is it that's not natural? Week. The week, yes. And so here we can thank our Jewish ancestors. So the whole development of marking off a 7-day period is in fact at the very heart of what it means to be part of God's people in the Old Testament. And we know that because it got codified in one of the greatest of the 10 Commandments, the 10 words of God. Keep holy the Sabbath day. So the 7th day of the week was set aside as a day of rest by the Jewish people, and the other 6 days were considered days of work. And not only was that considered so important, in the creation narrative in Genesis, God creates in 6 days, but even God himself, the Creator, who doesn't have to rest, rests on the Sabbath to sanctify the Sabbath day and make it holy. So there's something extraordinary about the week that is not connected to any natural rhythm, but was a gift given by God to humanity. So we're not meant to work ourselves to death. We need Sabbath rest. So I want to put in a plug for the importance of marking what we call today the day of the Lord, which is not the Sabbath day. Very early on, Christians began to mark the most important day of the week as the first day of the week, the day when God created the universe, the first day of creation, when God said, "Let there be light." Why did Christians make that their local day rather than the Sabbath day?
At the time, they were still Jewish, so they had to do a different day than the Sabbath.
All right, so the earliest Christians were, in fact, Jewish Christians. They did still observe the Sabbath, rest, but there's an even more important reason why the first day of the week became the day above all other days. The day of resurrection, when Christ rose from the dead on the first day of the week, the day after the Sabbath. Another way of putting it is that the resurrection of Jesus transfigured all time. So now the day of the Lord, that first day of the week, becomes preeminent. It is the holiest day of the year. So Sunday in the ancient church was considered the day of Easter every day of the week. 52 Easters a year. So the 8th day is the day of the new creation, when Jesus rose victorious over death. That is why, by the way, Sunday is the hinge of the entire liturgical year. Everything else revolves around Sunday, the day of the Lord. It's also why, from a Christian point of view, and this is ancient, going back 2,000 years, why presence at the Eucharist on the day of the Lord, on Sunday, is significant. It's not like any other day of the week. So another way of putting it is attendance at the liturgy of the Eucharist on Sundays, the day of the Lord, is an essential part of what it means to be a Christian. Any other Eucharist that we attend during the week, we could call those icing on the cake, as it were. Now, this includes, by the way, the Saturday evening liturgy. Now, why does the Saturday evening liturgy get included in the day of the Lord? So the ancient world marked the beginning of a new day, not like we do at midnight, but at sunset. So the new day began at sunset. So sometimes people get picky and say, well, if I go to a wedding mass at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, does that quote unquote count for Sunday? The answer is no, it doesn't count for Sunday. But any mass that occurs after 4 o'clock does count, 4 o'clock or later. So that's because, so follow the logic here, if you celebrate a Eucharist that's starting at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, before that liturgy is finished at the shortest day of the year, the sun will have set. So that marks the earliest point that one can properly regard it as a true vigil for the day of the Lord the following day. Unless you go to a very long mass that goes from 3:30 to like 5:30 or something. So just a technical little point, but the core of observing the day of the Lord, this is what sanctifies time for us Christians. We should mark the day of the Lord differently. And I want to put a plug in for connecting that with Sabbath rest as Christians, even though it's not technically the Sabbath day. To the extent that we make the day of the Lord different than every other day of the week, I think we do ourselves and our families a service. So I was on an airplane many years ago. Did I tell you this already? Flying for a retreat out in Colorado. And I pulled out the airline magazine out of the seat in front of me, and a secular modern Jewish family had written an article in the airline magazine called Rediscovering the Sabbath, how a modern Jewish family changed their lives. And I read the article, and they said what they did was they decided to keep not the slavish customs that some of their ancestors did. You couldn't walk a certain number of feet and that sort of thing, which Orthodox Jews still, by the way, are very particular about. But they decided that they had been saving their Saturday, which is the Sabbath day, they'd been saving that for all their catch-up work. So they were paying their bills, doing their laundry, cleaning their house, and they determined as a family they were going to set that day aside to do nothing that they considered onerous or work-related. So only things that would enable them as a family to enjoy their time together. So they'd go to museums or to the park and take a walk or eat a picnic. They did the food preparation the day before. Everything that they did was meant to be a time of joy together as a family. So they resisted yard work, laundry, paying bills, and all the menial tasks. So it stopped being the catch-all day of the week. And they discovered that it transformed not only their Sabbath day, but it also transformed the rest of the week, because once they rediscovered the joy of rest and being together as family, every other day of the week had a new joy about it. So I believe today it's important to recover that. When I was a child, it was protected for you by society. So I grew up in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, as some of you all have heard me say. And on Sundays, there was nothing open in Lawrenceburg. I mean, when I say nothing was open when I was a kid, nothing was open. No gas station, no drugstore. It was a pretty barren, quiet place. So if you needed milk, you needed to run on Saturday night before 9 o'clock and buy your carton of milk and your eggs or whatever you might need for the next day. So what did we do? We got up on Sunday morning. We usually had a big breakfast. We went to church together. And sometimes in the afternoon, we would drive around the country and visit relatives. And that's when you could drop in unexpectedly on people. And they didn't mind. They were happy you showed up. And then we always ended up at our grandparents' house where we got to watch The Wonderful World of Disney and things like that. And then we had the bigger extended family meal together that evening. And so the day as a child was really different than any other day of the week. And I think we need to recover that. So I want to make a plea for you in making time sacred to the extent that you can recreate in your own family, in your own personal life, the day of the Lord being a day set apart, not only to go to Sunday Mass, but also that you make that the day that is different than any other day. I believe that what that Jewish family rediscovered will happen. You'll discover that it positively transforms your family life. So, the Sunday, the day of the Lord, making time sacred. We also make time sacred each day of the week. And the Catholic tradition has developed what we call a liturgy of the hours. So one of the interesting things about the Liturgy of Hours, St. Paul in one of his letters says, pray always, pray without ceasing. And so we Christians are invited to always be people of prayer. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't set aside certain periods of time to consciously devote to prayer. And remember someone making the comment, my life is a prayer. That doesn't mean that we don't need to set aside time for prayer. Quite the contrary, I have discovered that those people who are very intentional about setting aside some time to be alone with God or with others, and to do that with prayer, that their day becomes a prayer. So someone said, what we always do is we pray to have a good day, but really, you should live your life well each day so that when you go to be with the Lord in prayer, you have much to bring in terms of fruit and gratitude to God for the way you've been living the last 24 hours. So early on, the Christian community took the words of St. Paul quite seriously. When they talked about praying always, they began to set aside hours of the day that were meant for prayer. And this became more and more structured when men and women in the 300s began to go out to the desert to be alone, to grow in holiness and get close to God. And then they began to form little monastic communities. And a quick word about that, we Catholics always think that monasteries and monastic communities oh, well, those are religious people. You know, those are like priests and nuns out there. But in fact, the movement of men and women going into the desert to be alone with God was not what we call a clerical movement. It wasn't priests who did that in the beginning. It was ordinary lay people, like most of you, who wanted to grow closer to God. And what they discovered was when they got to the desert, they had a hard time doing it individually. So they started clumping together in little communities. And thus they discovered what we call today community life together. So as a community, they could better live the gospel. So these were laymen and women who would go out and form communities. So the Benedictine monasteries have their roots in that. And Benedict says in his rule, ora et labora, we pray and we work. And if you ever get a chance to go to a monastery today, like St. Meinrad in Indiana, it's only 3 hours away, or Gethsemane in Kentucky, another one, a Trappist monastery, you will see that that religious community structures its life very intentionally around prayer and work. So every monk in the community has a job to do, whether it's milking the cow, or making the beer, or tending the sheep, or building the furniture. Every monk in the community was assigned a job, and they would work throughout the day with their hands. They also had set times to study, to use their minds. But always throughout the day was marked with prayer time. So typically in the Middle Ages, bells would be rung, and that would summon people from their places of work to the church, where they would do something very ancient. They took the most ancient prayers that we have, which are the Psalms of the Old Testament, and they prayed those 150 Psalms of the Old Testament. I love the Psalms for several reasons. Psalms are prayers very often addressed directly to God that capture every moment in life that you and I can ever experience. You read through the 150 Psalms, there is no human emotion that we have that doesn't get reflected in the Psalms. From ecstatic joy, gratitude, praise of God. In fact, they're called in Hebrew Tehillim, the praises of God. But they also have moments of horrific agony. My God, why have you abandoned me? So moments of intense sadness, feelings of persecution. My enemies are encircling me like a hive of bees. They're blazing like a fire among thorns. Moments of even anger. Wish you would take the babies of our enemies and bash them on the rocks, one of the Psalms says. The church doesn't include that one in its liturgy, not part of the universal prayer of the church. But, you know, every human experience is brought before the grace of God. It teaches how to pray, is what the Psalms do. So you think about the fact that the Psalms were prayed for centuries before Jesus, and that Jesus himself, as a faithful Jew, would have prayed the Psalms. In fact, on the cross in Mark's Gospel, he utters words from the beginning of one of the Psalms. My God, why have you abandoned me? So the Psalms would have been the prayer book of Jesus and his family, of the early church, and the early Christian church took the Psalms right into its liturgy of the hours. So to this very day, the church throughout the world is unceasingly offering up prayers to God. And when you stop and think about that for a moment, you know, the Catholic Church now, Christianity, spans the entire globe, northern and southern hemispheres. There is never a moment when in all the languages of humanity, that the praises of God are not being raised up all over the planet. So every priest in the Catholic Church and deacon are obligated daily to pray the Liturgy of the Hours faithfully, and monks and religious still do it. Many lay people have begun to do that since the Second Vatican Council as a way of praying, and sometimes in simplified forms. In a publication like Magnificat or Give Us This Day, gives a very simple morning and evening prayer and the daily Mass readings. It's a way, in a sense, that you can participate. But now in the modern world, with the internet, there are many apps that you can also actually pray the real prayer of the church that everybody's praying universally. One of the early Desert Fathers said, if not for the praises and the prayers of the holy ones, the wrath of God would have long ago consumed the world. Something along those lines, I'm paraphrasing, but can you imagine? They were so convicted that prayer made such a difference, that the prayer of God's people. And so the fact that we join into that prayer means that we're joining an endless, ceaseless prayer that's been rising up for centuries, and is rising up all over our planet constantly. So it's not like I'm starting something that hasn't been begun long ago. I'm joining the stream of prayer that's rising up to God always when I join the Liturgy of Hours. So the cardinal, or the hinge, the most important hours of a Liturgy of Hours are morning prayer and evening prayer. I would suggest, by the way, that if you want to start working on becoming a person who sanctifies your days, that makes them holy, as it were, sanctifies your time, that you consider starting with these 2-inch hours. It can be as simple for a layperson as beginning your day with a prayer of gratitude on your lips. God, thank you for giving me a new day. Help me, God, to do your will today. Help me to live for you. Help me to love my neighbor as you desire me to love them. So that simple act at the beginning of the day of remembering God and offering oneself to God. In the Catholic tradition, we call this the morning offering. I offer myself to God. And I love from the scriptures, here am I, Lord. I come to do your will. It's kind of the heart of the morning prayer. When I was a teenager, we had this priest, he said, some people wake up in the morning and they say, oh, good, Lord, it's morning. And he said, but you really should be starting the day with, good morning, Lord. It should be an act of praise. So how do we wake in the morning? How do we begin our day? Do we start our day with a remembrance of God, with gratitude, with an offering of self to God? It can make a difference. So the monks start, if you go, how many of you all have been to Gethsemane? So you know what time they start their morning prayers? About 3 o'clock in the morning. I think I went twice.
I went once.
If you go to St. Meinrad, they start at a more reasonable hour, so they're like 5 or 6. It's a little more reasonable. But you think about the church full of people before the sun rises, and they're singing the praises of God at that early hour of the morning. So morning prayer is the hinge beginning to the day. Evening prayer is meant to fall at the point when one, as the preface to the Liturgy of the Hours says, when the lighting of the lamps takes place. So at the point in the daylight when people would have been going home because it was getting too dark to work outside, the lighting of the lamps would have been the moment for evening prayer. So at day's end, the work of the day has ended. We sure live a different life than our ancestors had to live when they had to live under the light of the sun. They might have had oil lamps or some primitive form of lighting, but they didn't use it a lot because oil was costly. So when they got home in the evening, they would prepare the evening meal, but they didn't stay up too long so as not to waste that precious commodity of oil before they would retire for the night. So the darkness of night moved them to the longer nights of winter meant that they got more rest in the cold weather. Shorter days of summer were longer days of work, and also when more was required in the fields. So the evening hour, and we Catholics also talk about at day's end, it's important to look back over the day and to examine our consciousness. God, how did I live today? What were the moments when I recognized your presence or cooperated with your grace in my life? Were there any moments in the day that I got off track today that I need to correct on my way into tomorrow? Any apologies that I need to make or amends? Please forgive me if I was off track in some way and help me to do better tomorrow. So kind of a quick review at the end of day, both for the good moments of grace and also the moments we got off track. One of the things that I've learned, by the way, is the ones where I got off track, I can spot those if I'm attentive at day's end, Because usually in my case, they got associated with some form of emotional response. Fear, anger, distress about something. If I pay attention to that, I can see often where I got off track somehow. It's sometimes harder for me to stay still enough to say, okay, but God, where did I cooperate with your grace? And you should never end the day without becoming aware of that. You shouldn't stay with only your failures of the day. Catholics used to think you examine your conscience to, only show up how bad you were, and then you could end the day in guilt. That's not a good way to end the day. So, constructive amendment, yes, not stuck in the mire of guilt and shame at day's end. So there's not a day that goes by that we don't in some way do something for God, I believe. And so if not, we ask God to show us and help us to do a better job tomorrow. So in the evening, the monks gather again in the church for evening prayer, but there's also a later prayer than that. It's considered a lesser hour called night prayer. So they might do evening prayer at the moment of the evening, coming in to light the candles, but right before they would go to sleep at night, they do what's called night prayer. And I think in Gethsemane, evening prayer takes place about 5 o'clock in the evening or 4:30, and night prayer for them occurs about 7:30 because they go to bed at 8 o'clock to get up at 3 a.m. So if you're thinking about, how do I want to start sanctifying my time each day, you might start by thinking about how do you start and end your day. So it's always good when we lay down our head on our pillow at night, if we've not done it yet, to take a moment of recollection before we go to sleep at night. But lest you think that the monks only stopped in the morning and evening, they also had a midday prayer before their midday meal. Usually about noon, and then they inserted even smaller hours, mid-morning prayer about 9 o'clock, mid-afternoon prayer about 3 o'clock. So you literally see how they prayer and work. They kept interrupting the day with prayer. How do we do that as Christians living a busy life day in and day out, doing all the things that we're expected to do? I always talk about we should punctuate our day with prayer. And when you stop and think about how you punctuate a sentence, you don't just have periods at the ends of paragraphs, but you have exclamation points and question marks. You have quotation marks and dashes and hyphens. I like lots of unusual forms of punctuation. When I write articles for the bulletin and for the parish guides, they always remove those special things and put in ordinary comments and semicolons and stuff. I like unusual punctuation. And I think we should punctuate our day with prayer. And how do you punctuate the day with prayer? Well, if you walk outside in the morning, it's a beautiful morning. If you stop and say, thank you, God, this is beautiful. It's a gorgeous day. Thank you. If you're driving down the road and a car pulls out in front of you and you want to curse the car, God, help me to be patient. Bless that driver with whatever he or she needs today. I'm arriving at the office, I'm doing a job, and I run into a puzzle that I don't have an answer for. I don't know what to do. Holy Spirit, come, guide me, give me wisdom, help me to know what to say or do in this moment. So there's always moments throughout the day that we can offer those quick javelins of prayer to God. That's how I think we make the day holy. In the simplest form, prayer is a lifting of the heart and mind to God. So you don't have to get a copy of the Liturgy of the Hours and set aside time to do that. But I will tell you, I know some people, and I know one person in particular, who is the father of a number of children, who has a very intense job, and spends a lot of time with his kids, and he loves praying the Liturgy of the Hours. And he marks usually morning and evening prayer, if not midday prayer, at lunchtime. So, it's not impossible for a person even who lives a very busy life to start sanctifying their day in some such fashion. So there are lots of tools available today to do that. So I encourage you to think about how you would like to sanctify your time on a daily basis. So Sunday, Hinge Day, what are we going to do about Sabbath time, about marking the day of the Lord, making it different? How are we going to sanctify our daily time? Now I want to look at the year, the liturgical year. The other time, by the way, that's always good to pray, which I didn't neglected to mention yet, and most Catholics do it more naturally than almost any other time, are before meals. So a blessing before meals. So the liturgical year has a heart to it, a center. The most important days of the year. And for us Catholics, we call those the great Paschal Triduum, the great 3 days of Holy Thursday, beginning in the evening of Holy Thursday when we commemorate the Last Supper of the Lord, the night when he instituted the Eucharist. Good Friday, the next day, which is the day he died for us, all the way to the great vigil of Easter, after the sun sets on Saturday evening, and we begin to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. That great Paschal Triduum from Holy Thursday evening until Easter are the greatest, the most important part of the liturgical year. It's the center of time. So when you go to Jerusalem, there is the place where the cross was placed on Calvary, and there's also the empty tomb of Jesus. They're all under one roof these days in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And in between those two locations, there's also a chapel. And the guide that we had said that chapel was considered the center of the world. So in the ancient world, they thought about the world as being 3 continents. Africa extending in one direction, Asia in the other, Europe in the third. Well, what was right in the center of those 3 continents was Israel, the Holy Land. What was in the center of Israel was Jerusalem, the Holy City. What was in the center of the Holy City was the temple. So for Christians, of course, the center is no longer the temple of the physical building, but it's the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So you could say in a way that the death and resurrection of Jesus are the center of our Christian faith. And so that's symbolically lived out by an annual commemoration of the Easter mystery that we celebrate every Sunday of the year. So this is the big annual marking of that mystery. So important is it for us that we have an entire week beforehand to get ready for it called Holy Week. Palm Sunday, the commemoration of Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, begins Holy Week. So we have an entire week, Holy Week, to get ready for the great Paschal Triduum. And so powerful is the importance of the resurrection that we can't fit it all in one day or even the Sundays of the year. So we celebrate a 50-day season of Easter, beginning with Easter Sunday and going 50 days later to the great feast of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came. But one shouldn't just jump into Holy Week unprepared, and so a whole season unfolds before it, the 40 days of Lent, which are a preparation for the great celebration of the Easter mystery. So for 40 full days before Easter, we're preparing for it. Some people call those the great 90 days. And I think fittingly so. So the 40 days of Lent, marked by prayer, intensified. We should be praying more intensely during those 40 days by an increased fasting, letting go of things we don't really need during those days. And you'll often hear Catholics talk about what they're quote-unquote giving up for Lent. And you know, there's certain things that we human beings really like that we don't want to let go of, like chocolate or alcohol or something like that, Catholics, or sweets that Catholics tend to gravitate around for whatever reasons. But there's lots of things that could be sacrificial to make the season, to prepare us for Easter. And then the third leg of Lent is almsgiving, generous love, especially for those who need most in our world. So those are the three great disciplines of Lent: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, that are preparing us to celebrate well the great Paschal mystery at Easter. So that's the heart of the liturgical year, going all the way to Pentecost. But the church over centuries, it can't help itself. It keeps adding things on. So after Pentecost, we also added on the feast of the body and blood of Christ, and the feast of the Trinity, and so forth. So it would be a jarring experience maybe to rush too quickly from the great 90 days into all green. So we have some festive Sundays that follow Pentecost. There's a second cycle built into the liturgical year of secondary importance beyond the death and resurrection of Jesus. What do you think that's focused on?
Christmas.
Or the birth of Jesus. I will say it's a secondary season in a sense because we have a pretty good certitude, by the way, at what time of year the Passover takes place. That's been part of the calendar for a long time, so we know when Easter took place. So the dating of Easter is pretty close. We really have no idea when Jesus was born. So it got set on December the 25th because the Romans used to have the Feast of the Invincible Sun, because they could tell that the days were getting longer again after the shortest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. So they celebrated the victory of the sun over the darkness. And the Christians said, the true sun is the Son of God. He's the one who truly conquered darkness. So let us mark this time of year with the incarnation and birth of Jesus. And thus, the timing of Christmas got set following the winter solstice on December the 25th. So, but again, you can't just rush into a celebration like that without proper preparation. So we were given a 4-week period of time that we call Advent to prepare for the great Christmas mystery. I should have also mentioned, by the way, that even Easter Sunday isn't confined to a single day or a 50-day season. It's actually an octave, so there are 8 days. So from Easter Sunday till the Sunday that follows, the octave of Easter, it's called, is considered the great day of Easter. We also have the octave of Christmas. So for the 8 days from December the 25th until January the 1st are all considered part of the great octave of Christmas. And that ends on January the 1st when we commemorate Mary and her most important role as Mother of God, because if not for Mary, Jesus would not have been born. But for us Catholics, the Christmas season does not end, even with the end of the Christmas octave. It goes to the feast, the great feast of the Epiphany. And the thing that most Catholics associate with Epiphany more than anything else is the visit of the Magi, the astrologers, to adore the Christ child. But it also was the day when the church marked the other great epiphanies, the manifestation of Jesus at Cana in Galilee, transforming water into wine, was also considered an epiphany, as well as his baptism in the Jordan River when the Spirit descended and the Father spoke, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." So those moments of epiphany get connected, particularly the baptism of the Lord formally ends the Christmas season. So I want to make a quick note about this. We Catholics, we like to continue to dwell on the mystery long after the first moment we begin to celebrate it, which is in keeping with our Jewish brothers and sisters who extended feasts out over days. So for us, the Christmas season begins with the vigil of Christmas Mass, and it ends with the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord. So how do we make that truly a time set apart to focus on the incarnation of Jesus? We're particularly challenged in America because we've made the season from Halloween until Christmas the Christmas season. So people put their Christmas, my sister, she doesn't watch this tape, my sister puts her Christmas tree up right after Halloween. So we can't do Thanksgiving at her house because she doesn't want anybody to see that she's got it up. So we go to my other sister's house. But the problem with that is that by the time you get to Christmas, you're kind of tired of it. So you're ready to move on, which is what we do as a country. I remember one December, I think it was 21st, I'm driving around downtown Nashville, listening to one of the stations that has Christmas music, and the announcer said, "Okay, we're going to play another Christmas song. Christmas is almost over now." I thought, December 21st, we're not even to Christmas yet, and it's almost over. So, but that's the way our secular culture thinks about things. We anticipate things, and then we get to it, we're done with it. So, but the church, on the other hand, takes a mystery and it meditates on it, it stays with it, and it unfolds it over time. So, and you know, in the old days, which is not that long ago, like 50s and before that, the Christmas tree would be put up on Christmas Eve night and decorated. And so the Christmas season really got marked at that point. So the 4 weeks of Advent deserve their own proper focus, their own proper time. So don't be so quick to rush to Christmas during Advent. Because Advent is about waiting for the coming of Christ in our life. And the church in its liturgy specifically is inviting us to think about the coming of Christ in our lives in three fundamental ways. What's one of those three fundamental ways, the coming of Christ? All right, that's a symbol we use, that came from the Lutherans, the Advent wreath. But the comings of Christ, which coming of Christ are we focused on during Advent? All right, that's what almost all Catholics say first, the birth of Jesus. But in fact, Advent is about more than that. There's a greater coming of Jesus that Advent is really looking to. What is that greater coming? Yes, the final coming of Christ at the end of time to consummate all creation. So even the readings at the beginning of Advent, the prayers, and the readings in the Liturgy of the Hours, the office of readings that priests and monks are required to read, they're all about preparing us to see Christ at the end of time, or at the end of our own life when we will meet Christ face to face. So Advent is really preparing us for the coming of Christ at the end in its first instance. Only when you get to December the 17th, and the week before the 25th, do you really begin to focus the spotlight on the narrative surrounding the birth of Jesus. So one way of looking at Advent is we start out with eager expectation, standing on our tiptoes, waiting for the coming of Christ to bring the consummation to all creation, to transfigure the universe, when all will be made one in God. So I think that's the great waiting and expectancy that our church should begin with. It's interesting, the church at the end of its liturgical year, before the start of Advent, also focuses on the end of time and preparing us. So it's more like a circle. So we end the year waiting for the coming of Christ, and we begin the new liturgical year. So what's the first day of the new year, of the liturgical year for Catholic Christians? Not December 25th, that was a good guess. First day of the liturgical year for Catholics is the first Sunday of Advent. So that's the beginning of a new liturgical year for us. And the end of the liturgical year is the Feast of Christ the King, which we're going to be celebrating this coming Sunday. So this coming Sunday is the last Sunday of the year, the Feast of Christ the King. We end the year by focusing on Christ's kingship over all creation. And then the following Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent. We start a brand new liturgical year, waiting for the coming of Christ at the end of time, or at the end of our personal lives. And indeed, at the end of the season, December 17th on, where we really do start focusing on the coming of Christ 2,000 years ago in the Incarnation. which we celebrate at Christmas. There is also a third coming that we are invited by the church fathers to think about during Advent. Beyond the first coming of Jesus 2,000 years ago and the final coming. What's that third coming? Not Passover, that was a good guess. Not Pentecost, that's getting close. Some of the early church fathers speak about in the office of readings, be attentive to the coming of Christ as he comes to you each day. How does Christ come to us daily? And are we attentive and awake and watchful in the face of the stranger, in the face of the other, in the beauty of creation, in the Eucharist, in the sacraments, in the stillness of our hearts? So Christ is already coming to us daily. So Advent is waking us up to be ready for the coming of Christ at the end of time, celebrating his first coming, but also to waken us to the many ways that Christ is coming to us every day. What you've done for the least of my brothers and sisters, Christ says, you did for me. So Christ comes to us in the face of the needy, in the face of the stranger, the hungry, the naked, the imprisoned, the sick. So Christ shows up in a lot of ways. When the cardinal in Boston, who is the cardinal there? He's one of the Pope's like 8 advisors, you know. Who is that cardinal? Sean O'Malley, Cardinal O'Malley. When he was installed as Archbishop in Boston, there was a street person on the street in front of the cathedral. They were always going to the church for the celebration, and this person was obviously very upset and disturbed, and they said, "I'm Jesus, I'm Jesus, I'm Jesus." They were kind of repeating over and over. And he said, "That is Jesus in a distressing disguise." So he was intuitive enough to recognize in the face of that afflicted human being on the street, the face of Jesus. So the coming of Jesus daily in our life, we're called to pay attention to. So sanctifying time, what I love about the liturgical year is we're always circling the mystery of Christ over and over again. And it's like, should we ever get tired of that? We can never get tired of it. I went once to Seattle and was driving across the George Washington Bridge. It had been foggy when I got there. And suddenly there was a clearing, and I looked over my shoulder, and outside the window was Mount Rainier. It was like 60 to 100 miles away, but it was like it was huge. I almost wrecked the car. I'd never seen such a big mountain. I thought it was painted on the sky. It was so beautiful. I finally, when I got the first moment to stop and look at it, I just couldn't stop looking at it. And later I drove down to the mountain, stayed in the park, and no matter how long I was there, I kept seeing new beauty, and I would end up driving to the other side of the mountain. Everywhere I looked at it, every vista was equally beautiful. So I thought I could drive around Mount Rainier or hike around it the rest of my life and never exhaust its beauty. And in a sense, that's what the liturgical year is doing for us. It's letting us circle the mystery of Christ over and over again so that Christ begins to transform us and make us into himself. That's the whole purpose of sanctifying time. I'll do one quick bigger time slot. One of the things too that the church likes to do are Jubilee years, which are like every 50 years, but we've done more of them more frequently lately, to celebrate the great year of Jubilee, the year of mercy. And so to mark off bigger stretches of time sometimes happens as well in our life. So tonight I hope you thought a little bit about, how do we sanctify time? How do we make time holy in our life? What is the liturgy of the church about? It's a wonderful way to experience life. I will also add, the current liturgical year was designed by those of us living in the Northern Hemisphere, and it works beautifully in the Northern Hemisphere. It's more challenging for those who live down in Australia and down under because the seasons of the year don't match. We celebrate Easter when the world is becoming alive again. The leaves are falling on the tree and things are becoming bare when we're thinking about Christ coming at the end to consummate creation. And the darkness and stillness of winter, when the darkness is greatest, the light of the world is born. I mean, it's a beautiful connection with our liturgical year and the natural seasons and cycles of the earth.
Father, constructive thought that while Christmas is picked at one day, Easter rotates around. You might want to make some comment on that.
Yeah, the date of Easter, the complexity of how it gets picked. December 25th is always Christmas. The Passover always falls on the first Saturday that follows the full moon of the spring, the full moon of the spring, and Easter gets connected with that. So it's a matter of watching when the full moon takes place in the spring, and then dating Easter from that. And that's why Easter can move forward and back up to 30 days in either direction. And also, there was a little disagreement. You know, we never heard our disagreements in the early church between the Eastern and Western Christians. So the dating of Easter sometimes doesn't get marked exactly the same. So sometimes that falls a week apart in the Orthodox and the Catholic traditions. Some years it's the same, some years it varies. But the Easterners were doing it their way first, and Rome changed it. And they never quite got over that. They said, we did not keep the ancient tradition. And early on, the Pope said, that's okay, you should follow us now that we've done it this way. And the Eastern Church Fathers said, no, we're not going to do that. And the Pope said, okay. And then the later Pope said, no, you're wrong, you can't do that anymore. So, you know, it's interesting how the history of things unfolds over time. So, but that's less important than we celebrate it. So, any other questions about tonight's topic? Okay, it's time to go to our tables and share it. So, enjoy your evening.